Good afternoon and welcome to this session at our annual Grants Colloquium. My name is John Witvliet from the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship. It's a great joy to be listening in this session with all of you. I'm especially grateful to our colleague, Mr. Chan Jang, who is here as our tech coordinator for this session. Wonderful ministry of hospitality among us. We're so grateful. And I'm very grateful to be joined by a wonderful group of grantees who have been completing their journey of their year-long Teacher Scholar Grants Program. And so it's wonderful to welcome Erik Carter, who's joining us from Nashville, Tennessee, I believe, Erik, is that right? And it's wonderful to have Paul Galbreath, who's here, Union Seminary in Virginia. We're grateful to have you here. Grateful to have Sarah Johnson and Carol Penner, who represent a wonderful project within the Mennonite tradition. So grateful to have you both with us. Robert Pendergraft, who's here from the great state of Texas in this conversation, Mary Hardin Baylor University. We look forward to hearing from each of these four projects in the next while. And each of our teacher scholars will offer a TED Talk summary of learning from their grant. To all of you, I heartily welcome your questions. Simply click the Q&A button that you will find on your screen and type questions. We will likely have opportunity for only one or so of those after each of the TED Talks, with additional time at the end. And I will read select questions that come along. I'm quite confident there'll be many more questions than we will have time for. But nevertheless, it will be wonderful to see what kinds of questions emerge, and that in turn will only seed future learning. Our dream in being able to do teacher scholar grants and worshiping community grants is to build strong bridges between the work that teacher scholars do and congregations. And we all want to be learning together, and congregations have a great deal to teach teacher scholars. Teacher scholars in turn have a great deal to offer and receive from congregations, and it's in this kind of session that we can make that exchange more fruitful. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our first presentation. Erik, we're so grateful for your good work at VanderBilt University. Will you take it away?
Thank you, John, and thank you everyone for being part of this conversation. Thrilled to share some of the work that we're learning through our Accessible Worship Project. And as many of you know, there are more than 60 million Americans with disabilities. That's 1 in 5 residents of any small town or big city or in between suburb all across the US. And every one of our communities is filled with family members and neighbors and coworkers and fellow citizens who are experiencing or will eventually experiencing disability, whether that's a physical or cognitive or sensory or emotional or in other areas. And then every one of our communities also is filled with churches that are called to be places of inclusion and belonging and contribution for people with disabilities. Without asterisks, no exceptions. And this, though, remains such a place of uncertainty for so many congregations. They struggle to welcome and weave people with disabilities fully into all aspects of the life of their faith community. And while worship is not constrained to the formal times when we gather together as a body, it's within that context of regular corporate worship that inaccessibility so often becomes evident. And so my Teacher Scholar program has been pursuing answers to 4 overarching questions. What does it really mean to make worship accessible, truly accessible for all of the community? And what are the barriers and the tensions that keep churches from reflecting on and then refining their worship practices? What are the postures and the practices that churches might pursue in this area? And what are the promising approaches then for moving forward as a congregation? And these are really important questions for the more than 300,000 churches across the US and many, many more all around the world. What does it look like to be a truly welcoming and inclusive congregation? Well, so this has been a research project, and it's incorporated these multiple phases that are really designed to speak to these questions. We started off with a systematic review of all the published research that has addressed the ways that churches support the faith and the flourishing of people with disabilities and their families. And for those who are interested in that, I'd love to share that out with you separately. But the heart of the project has really been these qualitative interviews. We started with in-depth conversations with people with disabilities about their experiences at church and in worship. about their views about what accessibility means to them, and about what their recommendations have been for churches and worship leaders. And we finished 39 of those interviews already. And then we turned our conversation then toward individuals involved in planning and leading worship. And we've been asking them about how they approach this task of worship planning, and what are their understandings of accessibility as it relates to disability. What would be the resources they would find most helpful, and what are their recommendations in this area of worship renewal? We finished 9 of these interviews before the pandemic, and we're hoping to resume those as we continue. We've also visited some churches that are really noted for their accessibility, a few of which were designed from the very outset with individuals with developmental disabilities in mind as their core members. And all of this has been aimed at really developing practical reflection tools for churches in this particular area, and we hope those will begin to be released later this summer and fall. We've been really grateful for the nearly 50 people who've shared their time and experiences and perspectives with us so far. We've recruited people all throughout Tennessee using social media and announcements and disability organizations and through personal connections. And we built out a website where those project findings will be posted later this fall. And so for those of you who want to learn more about kind of the individuals we've talked with and sort of the different kinds of disabilities they may be experiencing, the poster has more of those details. What I thought I would do is share a bit about what we've heard so far from these interviews. What are the aspects of worship that have been raised in these conversations about accessibility and worship? So let me share just a sampling of some of the themes that have been emerging for churches maybe like yours that are striving to be places where everyone worships, everyone serves, everyone belongs. And for now, I'm going to frame these as barriers, though I want to emphasize in all of these stories we've heard from individuals, these issues are both barriers or potential facilitators, areas maybe to attend to as we think about worship. And the first is a familiar one. It's those architectural barriers, the physical features of our sanctuaries and buildings that maybe make it impossible or difficult for some people to be part of certain elements of worship. It's the idea if you can't get in or you can't go, you're not going to come. So this we often talk about that as the stairs and other issues, the need for the ramp. And then there's attitudinal barriers, those beliefs and feelings and inclinations of others in the congregation that sometimes maybe lead them to just overlook or ignore or even diminish people with disabilities. So here it's not the stairs, S-T-A-I-R-S, but the stairs, S-T-A-R-E-S, the attitudinal beliefs that drive how people engage or don't engage with individuals. Also raised was the intellectual barriers. We talk with lots of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and what was raised was the extent to which preaching and reading and other information was shared in ways that maybe weren't understandable to everyone in the congregation, that didn't recognize that people come from with different levels of education or background or ability to understand. We heard about sensory concerns and considerations, the ways in which volume and lighting and sense and other features of an environment might hinder presence or participation. And I was on one of the breakouts earlier talking about the flashlight culture, I guess, of congregations that have become so dim and dark that it's difficult to see, for example. We heard about the interpersonal dimensions of worship, those social aspects that take place before and during and after the service, and the extent to which people with disabilities are noticed and welcomed and reached out to and befriended or overlooked and ignored. We heard about issues related to communication barriers and considerations about how we share information with the congregation during the service, whether that's in written ways that require reading or whether in print or braille or on the screen. Are we sharing things in ways and languages that can be understood? And we heard a lot about technology before the pandemic. This was often phrased as the absence of technology that could enable someone's participation. And it was fascinating as we've talked to people after the pandemic, the reaction of people with disabilities who said all of these technologies that churches weren't willing to put in place for people with disabilities, that the pandemic led them to introduce for everyone. And so lots of innovation there in terms of technology. We heard about some of the liturgical barriers, the specific ways in which people are involved in different aspects of worship services, whether that's communion or the offering or other kinds of things. But particularly prominent were the views related to disability, theological views, the ways that views of disability were expressed in song or prayers or preaching that may reflect the views of the world more so than the views of God. And troublesome texts or the way those texts are treated. We heard a lot about language, the ways in which disability is described or discussed, sometimes in ways that are insensitive or hurtful, and sometimes in ways that reveal maybe an underlying attitude, but most often just reflected a way of not knowing appropriate alternatives. And then there were the postures that were reflected in congregations. We often think about these as mindsets. People talked about a posture in their congregation marked by love and a willingness to go to great lengths to make sure someone could be part of everything we offered, love out of rather than obligation. And then there were the expectations, those unwritten rules that every one of our churches is replete with about what is and is not okay at certain times or in the sanctuary as well. These are the flexibles of worship that we're sometimes so resistant to adapting if it allows someone to participate. And then the last dimension was this issue of supports, the supports that are needed to enable people to be part of different elements of worship that weren't available or were insufficient. No two people raise the same set of issues or concerns, and these aren't ordered in any sense of order of increasing importance, but they're just issues that were raised and things we might attend to. So what are some of the key takeaways so far from this project? Well, one is that the worship experiences of people with disabilities varied widely, from welcoming to wounding, from very inclusive to very exclusive. There have been no lukewarm stories in those 39 interviews. Incredible hospitality and incredible heartbreak in those stories. Second, we've realized that accessibility means very different things to different people. And so it's important to ask those good questions. But definitions are often anchored to the experiences of anyone else. What would this look like for anyone else to be part of this community? And what can you do to make sure that, that I also have those opportunities and supports? The key was that we've got to be flexible and have alternatives. There just can't be asterisks that says everyone but you. We learned that practices often follow postures. The views that people hold about worship and disability obviously shape how they choose to gather. And people talked a lot about mindset, what we believe about people, about worship, about how who God is, that shapes our decisions about what we do and don't do. And we also, in talking to the 9 worship leaders, realized that they affirmed their uncertainty about what this actually means, but they expressed this willingness to consider changes. And we have probably a sample that's pretty slanted in a more inclined to do something direction, but they're eager for guidance. They want to do better. They're willing to try something. They just aren't sure what to do. And we also learned about the importance here of regular reflection as a congregation. Congregations should be proactive in thinking about how they can become more accessible. And then individuals with disabilities have to think about how they wisely, winsomely advocate for things they need that churches may be overlooking or just never thought of. And the last sort of takeaway has been this sort of recommendations, as we ask for recommendations from people with disabilities, this emphasis on small changes being so critical, not to minimize large scale changes that need to happen, but people talked about little gestures and things that could do that really would make a profound difference for participation. So I'm grateful for the resources of the Institute. I look forward to sharing more about the practical strategies we're learning later this fall.
Great. Thank you, Erik, so much. Wonderful to hear this. We'll take time for one question now. And let me say again to all participants that if you click the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen, you'll have the opportunity to type questions at any time. I do want Erik to voice the question that has been raised. Could you tell us about maybe an example of a technology that's been especially beneficial post-pandemic? What would be an example that really has been helpful?
Right. Well, I mean, we're even on one of those examples that as much as we lament what Zoom does, it is enabled people to participate who had no other way of being part of congregational activities. But more than that, it was how this technology like these Zoom and FaceTime and other things have enabled people to connect socially between Sundays, the connections that it's enabled to connect throughout the week and remain in people's lives, to watch a movie together on Netflix Party, to check in on how people are doing in ways that we never really thought about because they weren't ubiquitous technologies that they are now. So Zoom, not as a way of becoming audiences to worship, but as a way of personally connecting one to another throughout the week.
Very good. Thank you very, very much. We look forward to coming back. Right now, we're going to move, though, to Carol Penner and Sarah Johnson. This is a wonderful project called Together in Worship, connected with Conrad Grebel University College. And so, Carol, Sarah, take it away.
Hi, everyone. I'm very happy to tell you about our project, the website, creating a worship resource website called togetherinworship.net. And one of the things about our project is that it was in process for 2 years before we applied for the Calvin Grant. And so we were really appreciative of getting the Calvin Grant because it helped us to go to another level on this project. So our goal is to create a website for our denomination's family of churches. And I'm a Mennonite, which is a small Protestant denomination that had their origin in the Radical Reformation of the 16th century. There are around 670,000 Mennonites in North America, which makes it a relatively small denomination. But we're part of a larger world family called Anabaptists. And today there are 2.16 million members of the Mennonite World Conference. And you can see that there are Mennonites in different parts of the world, especially Africa, India, and Indonesia. Mennonite theological distinctives, in case you don't know anything about Mennonites, include a strong emphasis on discipleship, community, and peace and justice. So why did we need a website? Mennonite worship is congregationally based and often led by volunteers who have very little or no theological training. We have no denominational staff who are in charge of worship or creating resources. And we are very good at creating hymn books because singing is a really important part of our tradition, but we don't use an official prayer book or service book. Often words for worship are not spontaneous, they're prepared in advance. So the people who lead the services, where do they find their material? The research showed that people are looking for their resources online rather than in books. And our denomination simply doesn't have a central website to find worship resources. A few Mennonite individuals have blogs that are popular. I have a worship blog called Leading in Worship. And one resource center has worship material on it, but it was clunky to use and not very popular compared to the blogs of individuals. So our project was to create a centralized website that would help foster identity for Mennonites. Because Mennonite polity is so congregationally based, there is a really wide array of worship styles and practices and a great deal of cultural diversity, as in all denominations. A website reflecting all that diversity would help us get to know each other better as a church. And a website would help us share Mennonite voices with the wider ecumenical community. So a small group of people from across Canada and the United States started having Zoom meetings a couple of years ago, and we named our project Together in Worship. Together in Worship is a curated collection of free online resources from Anabaptist sources that support communal Christian worship. This is not an official denominational project. We have no staff, we have no funding, except for the grants we apply for. It is run with volunteers. It costs money to make a website, and so we were so appreciative of this Teacher Scholar grant. After receiving the grant, we were able to have an in-person meeting in Winnipeg where we talked about our project goals, our visioning, and we created working groups. And one of the big decisions was that we decided to partner with a Mennonite resource center called Common Word. We also met with a web designer about our goals and a graphic designer to tell her about the look and feel we were going for. Copyright and permissions were things we talked about, as well as partnerships with Mennonite organizations so we could use the material they produced. Part of our meeting together involved deciding what we were not going to do. There are lots of great resources online that are compatible with Mennonite theology, but we decided not to recurate material from the websites of other denominations. Our goal on Together in Worship is to curate worship material that's created by Mennonites or people from the broader Anabaptist Church. We're on track for a fall launch for our website, even though COVID-19 has delayed our ability to test the website with congregations. Sarah's going to tell you more about the website.
Thanks to this grant, we were able to make significant progress on 3 major aspects of Together in Worship. First, we developed a base of content for the website. Last summer, we added more than 1,100 resources. Most of these resources are thematic or seasonal worship series and words for worship previously published in short-term products like magazines, bulletin covers, and supports for specific events. Many of these resources were developed collaboratively by teams across Canada and the United States or around the world. These resources cover the seasons and days of the Christian year and reference a broad range of scripture readings. This base of content means that when users search the site, hopefully most of the time they will find something related to what they are looking for. This summer, we are building on this foundation and adding multimedia resources, videos and songs, as well as poetry, and resources rooted in the 16th century history of the Mennonite tradition. In the future, our priorities include teaching resources, more supports for contemporary worship, and resources emerging from and intended for congregations who worship in languages other than English. We see Together in Worship as a space for sharing resources across communities and fostering the development of new material. The second thing that we have been able to do because of the grant is to construct the website itself. As Carol mentioned, this became a partnership with an existing website called Common Word. And this partnership allows us to have robust search features, including a strong scripture search function. It also allows us to have a powerful system of filters, like those you might be familiar with from Amazon or Barnes & Noble, so that users can sort content into different ways to find what they're looking for and maybe even discover content they didn't know that they needed. There are also some unique features of Together in Worship. And one is that we are using PDFs to make resources available. The content of the PDF will be visible online and just look like it's part of the website. And this allows us to maintain formats on text, which is important for many of these types of items, and to control what is viewed in search results, which reduces the number of clicks needed to determine if a resource is a good fit for a particular use. And it allows us to provide clear copyright information. PDFs are easy to use on a tablet or to download and print. Third, the grant supported the process of curating and cataloging material. We hired 3 graduate students in theology to curate and catalog resources last summer. This summer, we have 4 students curating resources as a COVID-friendly supervised experience in ministry, as well as 2 pastors curating as volunteers, and members of the leadership team learning the process as well. We hope to add a couple of 1,000 additional resources over the next few months. Together in Worship is a project with a big vision and a lot of small details. And what makes this work is we have a great team that brings together different skills and interests and is united in a passion for caring for the worship life of the church. We look forward to continuing to develop the website in the years ahead and are so excited to launch Together in Worship this fall.
Very good. Well, Carol, thank you. Sarah, thank you so much. So one question that emerges here is a question about the diversity and voices that you've curated. Many of us have a pretty vivid idea of what stylistic diversity looks like with respect to music. What did you learn about the different approaches to language and the other art forms that you were drawing on along the way, and how the diversity enriches the conversation?
I'll let Sarah answer that question because she's been working on the diverse things this summer.
Well, one of the reasons we're so excited about Together in Worship is we can do things online that we can't do in print resources. And many of the congregations in Mennonite Church Canada and Mennonite Church USA who speak more than 25 languages as their primary language in worship are leaning more into contemporary expressions of worship. And there are often only a few congregations that would be in a language group. So we see this as a space where we can do more resourcing that is emerging from and speaking into the breadth of the tradition. That's mostly present at this time in terms of who is curating resources and in terms of resources from Mennonite World Conference. And it's one of the areas we're expanding significantly this summer and are looking for ways to do really thoughtfully moving forward into the years ahead as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Continue to welcome questions that you want to add at this time. And some of them we'll come back to at the very end of the session. Right now, we're going to turn our attention to the good work of Paul Galbreath. It's Union Presbyterian Seminary. And let me correct myself earlier, Paul. It's the Charlotte campus, right, that you're connected with. And so with that, I'll hand it to you. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I am in Charlotte now. I used to be in Richmond, though. So, yes, glad for the chance to share with you a bit about my project. My project is really interested in looking at the connection between worship and earth care. And in particular, I'm committed to linking creation care with our baptismal vows and discipleship. And as this project has emerged, some of us who've worked in this area for a while, the usual way that I've worked on a project like this and others have worked in similar projects is to look at the text that we use in worship and to recognize that we need texts that fully embrace the language of the earth and reclaim the language of water and the gift of water as central to our baptismal rites. So, for example, a baptismal prayer that I wrote is in the new Book of Common Worship that recently came out. Or the Anglican Church of Canada added a baptismal vow that included the recognition of the importance of caring for creation as part of our lives of discipleship. This time around in this project, what I've done is I've partnered with 6 congregations in the Pacific Northwest. And in conversation with them, I've discovered that really what they longed for was experiences that prompted them in terms of these basic connections. The texts are helpful and valuable, but to experience this in a firsthand way is kind of a new opportunity for them to embed this theological approach in their congregations. So the grant for which I'm grateful that Calvin gave me funding to do is to work with these congregations to curate experiences and opportunities that offer these kind of lens. What I'd like to do is show you a video of a walk that I led with a congregation on the Oregon coast in Newport, Oregon, where we shared the experience of carrying water from the ocean to the baptismal font as a way of us sharing this pilgrimage of feeling and seeing the link, the connection between earth care and baptism. So I'll let Chan cue up the video. It's about 6 minutes long and we'll watch it together.
I just feel very close with the sacredness of life.
You can kind of see what you're talking about when you say, these walks, you're walking with God.
I was really listening to all the sounds along the way. So it was kind of a journey of remembering observation. Oftentimes we rely on what we know and we go towards that, and there's a certain beauty and tradition, but there is also a lot of freedom and creativity and joy in exploring new ways of being and new ways of being together and new ways of worshiping.
It reminded me a lot of how we can live so close to nature, but not really take advantage of being in nature.
We begin by gathering on the beach and listening to the words of Psalm 104. Let my whole being bless the Lord. Lord my God, how fantastic you are. You are clothed in glory and grandeur. So how can we learn to praise God with our whole being? How How can we learn to see and name the divine beauty that surrounds us? As we walk from the beach to the baptismal font, we're focusing on our senses, what we see, hear, smell, taste, and touch. These fantastic senses that are a part of our lives. We're concentrating on the ways that they connect us to the gift of water as the source of life and all that water provides us. Our walk follows the path of Nye Creek, where it runs into the Pacific Ocean, back to the places where the water bubbles up out of the earth, comes together, and runs down the hillsides. Stop in the park and listen to the sounds of Nye Creek running alongside the walking path. Under the canopy of the trees, we hear the calling out to us and to one another. And we share with each other what we've seen and felt on the walk so far. Gift of creation is to learn to see the signs of the divine in the world around us. And
We're having some buffering problems, so the rest of the journey is to the church, into the sanctuary, where the water is then poured into the baptismal font, and together around the font, we invite one another into a kind of accountability of how we will care for creation, how we'll respond to the gift of water that gives us life and that gives us new life in baptism. So what I found in this is kind of the opportunity for people to see and experience for themselves this kind of tangible, close relationship. Second thing that I was able to do was to provide a Lenten devotional book that looks at the elements of the earth, and over each day during Lent and Holy Week invites people to reflect on their experiences of God and creation as part of this ongoing encouragement to foster a sense of Christian discipleship that connects us to the earth as central to our Christian faith.
Very good. Thank you, Paul, very much. Very grateful, and sorry about that technical glitch we had, but it was wonderful to be brought into that community. We've had a question here. Could you tell us a little bit about the community there, both the prior understandings or sense of mission and vision they had, and then also what some of the spectrum of responses was to the experience that we saw there?
So that congregation, which I've known for a long time, and I knew their former pastor really well. They have a new young woman who's in the video, who's their pastor. It has been a congregation that's been engaged in earth care, and yet that their engagement in earth care never really quite appears on Sunday morning in worship, but perhaps occasionally for a special service. So I think one of the opportunities here for people who participated in the walk, and for people who didn't participate in the walk, by the way, as well, was that you heard some of their voices at the beginning of the video, where it was almost a kind of sense of self-discovery, of their discovery. And then on Sunday, this walk took place on a Saturday. On Sunday morning, the pastor actually in her sermon told the story of the walk itself as a way of kind of lodging it further into the life of the community. So I'm hopeful that those circles are being broadened in terms of the engagement.
Thank you. Thank you. And it strikes me that all across the United States, there are many more congregations meeting outdoors this summer because of COVID-19. And something like the vision you've described has rich possibilities for people to think about that as not a negative disruption, but a positive opportunity. Common theme with Erik, something that you shared. So perhaps we can reflect a little bit on that again in discussion in a few minutes. It's now a joy to turn our attention to Robert Pendergraft. Thank you, Robert, for your good work this year. University of Mary Hardin, Baylor, Belton, Texas. We're glad to have your voice in the conversation, and take it away.
Thank you, sir. First, I'd like to just say thank you to Calvin for the opportunity to participate in this Teacher Scholar Grant program this year. While I think I started out with the goal of benefiting congregations, I feel like it really has been a tremendous blessing and benefit to myself personally, just as I've explored and gotten to have conversations and talk with so many of you and also so many colleagues from around this area and around the country. I want to begin by sharing with you kind of an overview of what I worked on this year and let that segue into what I have learned out of the project. So just as a means of overview, it started out as curating a source book for intergenerational worship. The idea being that I saw a need for resources that were very intentional about including all ages across the spectrum in worship services for liturgies that directly spoke to different ages. Often when you hear intergenerational worship, I think we think about including children, and that certainly is an important part. But one thing that I wanted to emphasize throughout the process was not just including children, but also including senior adults and youth, and spanning the entire age gamut. So as I began the conversation of creating this source book, one of the things that emerged from conversations early on was the idea that we already have resources we regularly use, but they're not necessarily intergenerational. How can we quickly produce resources that are? And the answer would be, well, we probably couldn't quickly produce resources for every different denomination that was interested. And so it kind of shifted to being, how can we help you craft resources or adapt things you're already doing and make them intentionally inclusive, intentionally intergenerational? That conversation took place largely at a worship summit we were able to host on our campus. Thankfully, it was planned for January before all of this started. And so we were able to spend a couple days in discussions. We had 6 different denominations represented, which for our campus, we're a Texas Baptist University and haven't always been the greatest at inviting other voices to the table. And so that was I thought a great thing to see such widespread participation for us. In those conversations, we were able to host Holly Allen, who has written extensively on the idea of intergenerational worship, and also spent a lot of the time listening to people. What would be helpful for those congregations? What are they looking for? The folks that were there were both pastors, music ministers, worship leaders, and lay people. Often those lay folks were either overseeing the senior adult ministries or the children's ministries of the church. And so it was great to have all these voices at the table. And we're going to get into what we learned from that soon. Some new resources for corporate worship have emerged from this. One of the things I've spent time doing is writing hymns, specifically that address all ages in worship. And that's kind of I think a side project that came out of this that I didn't necessarily expect to come out of this when I began. And then along with the website, I initially had no intention of running a blog off that site, but with COVID and just the incredible shifting of ministry that has happened, it's become apparent that the ability to write and direct people to resources that are timely and appropriate would be helpful. So that's something we're also working on. So let me just get into 3 big picture reflections. There's certainly other things we've learned and other things that have come up, but let me give you 3 points of reflection that I feel like are the biggest takeaways from this project so far. The first one is this: how do we create resources that address one form of discrimination without addressing all forms of discrimination? I don't know that I've got the answer to that question, but as I created and crafted and worked with churches to make their prayers and their songs intentional of including all ages, there's a lot of other areas where people are left out. And so it almost brings on feelings of inadequacy, just as we are trying to address one area, but as one area is addressed, it makes other areas even more evident. And so that's been an overarching question that I've been working through and working with these congregations that I've been helping through this time. The second reflection point, it was just something that emerged out of the worship summit. And it's this contextualization of principle is far superior to implementation of mandates. And what I mean by that is, rather than handing somebody a list of resources and saying, these are really great things you could do in your church, you should use them, it's far better to come alongside them and to say, what are you using and how can we adapt this to be more inclusive of all generations? And so that was really a turning point in January for the project, just hearing from all these different people over the previous year, and really helped shift and define where this was going long term. The third point that emerged that I think kind of surprised me, but maybe it shouldn't have, and it was this: that local churches are looking for accessibility and immediacy with resources. So rather than wanting to go and buy a book, they would much prefer being able to go to a website and download something. And they were less concerned about the quality of the content than they were with how accessible or the cost of it. I'm sure Carol and Sarah probably have found similar things with their project. And so that has caused me to largely rethink how the material is presented, and to shift. So for example, one of the things that shifted was the initial conception was to have an actual book. It then became a website, and then what the website was going to be, how it's indexed, all of those things have kind of shifted over these past several months as I've explored this. Then I wanted to give you just 2 local churches' responses to our project, things that we've heard from them since the pandemic began, in ways that, even though this is in its very early conception, they were able to adjust what they've been doing to be a little more inclusive. And the first one was this: that the ideas they heard at the summit largely shaped how they created online worship throughout this time. They said that having their staff sitting around the table and listening to different voices completely shifted the way they planned their services and the way they went about engaging folks in worship. And I thought that was a really great testimony to the benefit of the project. The other thing that I heard from more than one person was the appreciation for making conference and resources affordable and accessible to small congregations. There was an appreciation that, one, it was local, and so they didn't have to travel because they didn't have budget money to travel, but also an appreciation that we weren't making the website a subscription, or we weren't charging them every time they accessed something. Not that we certainly don't want to pay folks for creation of content, but just an appreciation that, and a recognition they're working with small budgets, and they just don't have the resources to put into worship planning materials. So those were two, I thought, testimonies to where this project is going that I'm excited about, and areas that we're going to grow on. So initially the website was supposed to be up and running in May. That's been pushed back. We lost our student that was doing web design during the COVID period. They had to go move home, and then they couldn't work off campus. And so anyway, we've had several challenges that we've had to overcome, but continuing to figure out new ways to overcome those challenges. And also, even though the grant is a one-year period, reconsidering this as being a more longitudinal project. So something that's going to be ongoing, something that will continue equipping the church. And we're hoping for a late summer website rollout.
Very good. Robert, thank you very much. This gives us a chance, from Calvin to simply affirm all of those adaptive changes that you made, and to say to all the attendees in the session currently how important that responsive adaptation can be as the year unfolds. We welcome ways that you respond to what you are learning along the way. And so, Robert, thank you for modeling that so well. Could you say a little bit more about any specific things that you're aware of that those congregations spoke about when they planned worship for the Sundays after the disruption caused by COVID? What were some of the specifics that they took from your earlier work together?
Absolutely. Well, two congregations have been very open with feedback. The first one, they actually, prior to being involved in the worship summit, had been separating the children during the worship time. And so they would attend what was essentially a Sunday school class while adults were in worship. They had begun once a month having children in their worship service after participating in our conversation. But once this hit, they realized that they couldn't produce content for every age group and put it online every week. And so what they began doing was trying to think of one element in the service and specifically addressing children at some point within that element. One of the things I encouraged them to do was to think through worship as a matrix across weeks, and maybe in the prayer be intentional in including children during a prayer, with the next week maybe intentional including a different age group. And so they used that strategy as a means to try to connect with all age groups, even though in a normal week setting they would have been separated. The other church we heard from was a very small congregation, and they had always considered that they were being intergenerational because they had children's sermon every week where they would set aside a portion of the service. And they were really concerned as they produced content for online worship that children would just watch this one portion of the service and not be engaged. And so they used some of the ideas we had talked through to be more integrative of including them in the whole service rather than just having one 3-minute segment that was designed for them.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks also to all of you who've been asking questions, and I want to thank many of our panelists who have been typing responses back to some of those along the way. Also, thanks, Chan, for posting the link to the video. We're grateful for that, so people will be able to see the end of the story, and that's wonderful. We have time for some discussion. And the first topic I'd like to discuss is hinted at in some of the questions, but it certainly is common to all this work, is to invite each of you to reflect on this connection between your life as a teacher-scholar and then the life of congregations. How have congregations been your teachers through this process. But then also, what advice would you have to congregations as they reach out for expertise and insights from teacher scholars? Certainly the learning goes back and forth. Certainly across North American Christianity, I'll say I think the gap is too big, where scholars can be more teachable and eager to learn, and congregations, if they would only look up for expertise, it's all around, especially across the ecumenical spectrum. So could we be, we'll just take it in the order of the presentations, and Erik, could I ask you to start?
Sure. Lots of parts to that. I think it's interesting because I'm a Christian who's a scholar who's also a member of a church, but I realized how much this endeavor has become cross-cultural work. You know, I'm someone from a secular academy partnering with someone in a congregation, someone from a field of special ed engaging with someone, you know, in the field of Christian ministry, someone who thinks empirically engaging with people who think theologically. So it's been interesting just to navigate how do we sort of become bilingual in talking about why this joint work matters to all of us collectively. Certainly the questions that we're trying to address as scholars came from hearing from churches that they struggle in this area of accessibility, but in then learning from them about their ideas and listening to what they're doing, I have learned more about how to approach inclusion that I can take back to the secular areas of school and work. So there are places where churches are doing innovative, incredibly innovative things here that we as the rest of society have much to learn from. So I think I'm realizing there's much expertise and experience hidden in the academy away from the church, and much experience and expertise in the church hidden away from the academy. And we've just got to find venues that we feel comfortable and confident sort of being vulnerable in navigating these conversations together.
Yeah, thank you. Carol and Sarah, how about you?
Well, one of the things is trying to collect resources from congregations and how they're worshiping. And as a teacher scholar, I'm thinking about inclusivity, and when people have resources that are very masculine dominated language, how is that received? And do we just put it up straight like that? Or do we try to massage the work that people produce to make it a little bit more inclusive? And there are tensions like that with a lot of different things. And we have faced these dilemmas about how much does our website reflect what is happening, and how much is it helping to shape the worship of our denomination. Maybe Sarah has something to add.
Yeah, thanks, Carol. A couple of things. One is that the idea that a website like this is necessary is really a response to a request that we've been hearing, and that in a series of focus groups that were part of shaping some print resources, it really emerged that when it comes to worship planning, a lot of people are looking for free online resources that have that kind of flexibility. So we're trying to meet that very specific request. And another gift of a website is that it's so flexible. So we can continue to develop this in directions in response to what is working and what isn't working. We don't know if it will ever really be finished, but that it has this capacity to respond to emerging needs in really critical situations. And that's always a conversation between teachers and scholars, and that we're learning from each other throughout that, and that every worshiping context is so unique, and there isn't a one-size-fits-all answer coming from scholars. So we need to have that conversation together, and I hope that Together in Worship is one space where that can happen.
Thank you. Paul?
I think I've discovered the importance of doing this work as conversational, and so going into congregations, rather than saying, here's a text that I think would be good for you, asking people about, in this instance, I would just have a forum, you know, after church, coffee hour, and say, where have you experienced God in the world? And I was astounded by this kind of outpouring of narratives from people who wanted to share these experiences, but didn't know if it was okay to do that in church because it hadn't been officially approved. And that's really what has kind of rechanneled my work in terms of thinking more about the importance of shared experiences where we all have the opportunity to learn from one another rather than it being one-way street, either what I give to a congregation or a congregation tries to correct my work.
Thank you. Robert?
Thanks, John. I would say two things here. Number one, I think this, as scholars, we have to be resistant to go in and tell people how to do things, but view it more as a partnership. And number two, I would say one way we can help is helping pastoral staff and clergy understand that the way that they view their congregation may not be the way that their congregation views itself, and partnering with them to help them really understand who they are and the way that they're being perceived by those in the pew, because they oftentimes are making decisions based on who they think they are, not necessarily on who their congregation sees them to be. And so I see that as being a place where we can all work together to really help one another.
Thank you. Thank you. We have just a few minutes, so time for only brief reply perhaps. But I'm aware that so often really satisfying projects leave us all thinking about actually a few more questions to ask than we had when we began. And so I'd like to ask each of you briefly to identify a question or two that you are asking that you don't have answers for, and particularly in light of how the pandemics of structural racism and COVID-19 are for us now a call, an invitation, opportunity, vocational call. And so what questions do you find yourself asking today? I mean, who knows what they may, how they may germinate in a year or two, but especially out of the work you've done as you look toward the future. Erik, could we start with you?
Sure. Well, I think this comes up even at hearing Robert's talk on intergenerational work and thinking about how these issues of accessibility apply to all different populations. So for me, as I've thought about what does it mean to welcome and weave the stranger into your community around disability, it raises the question of what does this look like for us to do this to anyone who's a stranger to our churches? And so how do these issues apply across promoting inclusion and belonging for anyone who's on the margins of a particular community? And that takes us into issues of culture and race and nationality and all sorts of other areas.
Okay, thank you. Carol and Sarah. You'll need to unmute, Carol. Thanks.
I think one of the things we struggle with is how do we have diversity of curators and diversity of the material we are curating, and that's an ongoing challenge that we will face. Sarah?
This expresses our next phase of what we hope will be a development really well. And I'm grateful for the question earlier, because we see this potential, but we know we have not lived into that potential. So thinking about working toward feeling our way through doing that in collaboration across the breadth of our denominations is a big next step. And that includes questions about visual art and contemporary worship and languages other than English and how we manage those types of material. And if that's what's needed, which is still a question we're exploring.
Thank you. And Paul?
Yeah, in the past, I've tried to think from the sanctuary out to the world, how the sacrament's connected to creation. And I'm increasingly interested in starting from outside and erasing this, what I think is a false division between sacred and secular. So if we're going to talk about discipleship, then it really has to permeate every aspect of our life, and making sure that we're not simply locating God on one day or one time or in one building, but that we have this holistic sense of what we're working towards.
Thank you. And Robert?
I think as I mentioned in my first reflection point, the question that comes up is how, if we're creating these resources to be intentionally inclusive of age groups that have been left out, we continue to, as we eliminate one area of discrimination, it seems like others pop up and are made even more visible and are highlighted. And so just how do we walk with congregations as they seek to be more inclusive and embrace people that look different than them, people that think different than them? How can we as scholars resource them and help them and walk with them to make changes to what they're doing?
Thank you. On behalf of all of us from Calvin, we are profoundly grateful. Congratulations to each of you for completion of this project. Let me continue to offer one encouragement to all attendees from congregations to be reaching out for expertise and encouragement from teacher scholars in this community, but then others near you. And for teacher scholars, especially to those who are just beginning projects, who've been listening in, we hope it's been a time of encouragement, and we're eager to hear what you have to say next year. It's a joy to be a part of all of the cross connections of learning that are happening. And with that, I'll simply say thank you. Thanks, Chan Jang, for your assistance. God bless you all, and enjoy break before we go to the next session. Thank you.